Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you. I'm going to be starting a video series on the biblical worldview and actually making a defense for the biblical worldview. And so I'll just be picking out just different Bible passages and just talking about them, discussing them, elaborating on them, and trying to provide proofs for their accuracy, their authenticity, their historicity, so on and so forth. And I'd like to start out with, um, of course, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, and ask the question: Is Genesis real history? Well, for many centuries now, the book of Genesis has been under attack and has been rendered as simply just myth, not true history, and this has become has come about as a result of a breakdown in philosophy and the so-called age and entrance of non-reason, where people just completely think of history as completely different and completely recreate it in a very, very different way and interpret it in a very, very different way. And as a result, this has affected man's history very, very much. Um, with the advent of this new way of thinking, and of course, evolutionary ideas had a lot to do with this, uh, entered the view of man as a kind of a primitive brute. He was not something special to be seen as something to be created by God, a special creature, a special creation with special capacities, but simply no different than the animals that we see around us, that we're just part of nature, and therefore we have to go down in nature and be like the animals, as opposed to looking up and looking up to God as our maker and our creator. And so this totally flipped, reversed the way we look at history. We no longer looked in a biblical sense or in a biblical approach or biblical perspective at history. And so a lot of the um, creation account and a lot of the book of Genesis simply was seen as non-historical, and a lot of higher critical theories developed as a result, and to try to kind of um, set aside or push aside the book of Genesis as real history, and they succeeded um, for a while in doing that. There's many of them, and although I could discuss quite a few of them, I only want to discuss the main one. And the most popular higher critical theory that developed out there was the so-called documentary hypothesis, which developed in the 19th century, which was proposed by Julian Wellhausen and others that worked with him. And he basically said that the first five books of the Bible were not written by Moses. They were written at a much later time, and they didn't actually reflect the history, the ancient history um, of the nation of Israel, and that it was just simply just myth, basically, is what it was. However, this theory itself was conceived in an unenlightened age of archaeological discovery. They just were ignorant of what archaeology had to offer when it came to the book of Genesis and how it would contribute to its accuracy, its authenticity, and historicity overall. And some of these theorists, these biblical scholars, especially from Germany, they were ignorant of the writing methods of the early people in the ancient world. They believed that the patriarchs weren't were unable to write, that they only held an oral tradition, and they were just very inaccurate in their analyses of the text itself. Their approach to it was somewhat unscientific, and as a result, uh, they developed this documentary hypothesis that different authors um, wrote the Bible, the first five books, the Torah, and then it was just passed down to us, but it's really, really all just myth. Well, I have a tendency to completely disagree with that. I don't agree with it one bit. I think that most of these theories, including the documentary hypothesis, has become obsolete. There are very few people in um, biblical circles, and especially biblical history circles, that still hold to the documentary hypothesis. I think it has been discarded for the most part, although you might still find just a few scholars here and there who might hold on to it. But for the most part, this theory itself, the documentary hypothesis, has completely been refuted, and it's no longer a valid theory in most of the eyes of biblical scholars and historians around the world. After some time, after, I don't know, say 75 to 80 years after that hypothesis was developed, came in Air Commander J.P. Wiseman, who developed the so-called Wiseman or tablet hypothesis or theory. Just to give you a little bit of background, P.J. Wiseman was an air commander in the British Air Force, and he, during his tour in modern Iraq, which was ancient Mesopotamia, came across a lot of archaeological findings, especially ancient clay tablets and stone tablets that were in that area, and he noticed that a lot of these tablets were written and were dated before Abraham, way before Abraham. We're talking 500, 800, 1,000 years before Abraham. And Abraham is supposedly supposed to have lived anywhere from 2000 BC to 2200 BC, according to some historical estimates. And so he did his own studies. He carefully examined the biblical text, and he looked at some of these clay tablets, and he saw a lot of similarities between the ancient script that was in these clay tablets and the book of Genesis. And one of the books that he actually, one of the very first ones that he wrote was New Discoveries in Babylonia about Genesis. And this is my copy. This is from 1950, 1952, 1953. But the first original copy, I believe, came out in 1929. But I'm not exactly sure. The other one that I have that actually also has that same book, which is combined with another book, and that one's the Creation Revealed in 6 Days. And then the first one is the Ancient Records and the Structure of Genesis. This one came out later. This was in the 1970s, and it's edited and updated by his son, Donald J. Wiseman. And his son also has one which even extends his dad's work further. Anyway, in his in his book, New Discoveries in Babylonia about Genesis, Wiseman claims that he holds the key, or he had found the key that unlocked the book, which pointed to its antiquity. There were two things that he mentions in this book. One of them is the Teledoth, and the other one is the Colophon, which would in some ways indicate that it's an ancient script, and that the tablets were that the book of Genesis was actually written on tablets and then compiled over time and all the way to Moses, and so the Teledoth, just briefly, because I encourage you to read the book. You can also find it online. I'll put it in the description below. But the Teledoth refers to, these are the generations of, or these are the histories of, and these would actually come at the end of the tablet in Genesis. And for the longest time, biblical scholars had thought that actually that came at the beginning. So when you read these are the generations of in the book of Genesis, you think that, well, after that you're going to see it's going to talk about the generations of who it mentioned, for instance, the generations of Adam, but it actually doesn't. What it actually has is it goes on to the next person. So, for instance, if you get to these are the generations of Adam, that's the end point of Adam's history, of Adam's generation, and then you get the next one, so which would be Noah after that. Um, so for the most part, for the longest time, I should say, historians were getting this backwards. That it came the beginning, but it actually came at the end. And also the colophon is also like a stamp that came at the end of a tablet. It would either be the name of the scribe who wrote it. It would have some kind of a time frame. It would also just to make sure that it established its a time period. They would also put like a significant event that went along with the tablet that would kind of give the time frame of when it actually was written. So there were these colophons. Colophons were ways of signing off, and and kind of letting the reader know who the writer was, what the kind of what the the the, the tablet was about. It's kind of like in our modern day books. We have, of course, we have at the top or on the face of on the cover of it, we have the name and the author of the person. Well, in ancient times, in the ancient script, they did that reverse. They put it at the end instead of the beginning or on the front of the writing piece. So for the longest time, scholars had seen that the book of Genesis was divided into sections and separated by these phrases. These are generations of. And so Wiseman suggested in his book that these were different tablets. And so we have these are the generations of, that's a sign off of the person who wrote it, who wrote what came before that. And then what came after that was the next tablet. And then at the end of that one, we have these are the generations of Noah. And we go on from there. And so the structure of Genesis indicates that, comparing with different clay tablets that he had found there in ancient Mesopotamia or modern Iraq, was that there were similarities, and this was the same literary style. And so he said, well, this is basically probably was written at a time when this was, and it was not written later, but it was written based, in antiquity. It was written a long time ago, and that same literary style and that structure remained for many centuries and many millennia, actually. He suggests that in looking at the book of Genesis, that the early tablets of Genesis were actually copied in Sumerio-Akkadian or Babylonian-Assyrian cuneiform writing style. And this actually, because of this actually led to the introduction of Babylonian words in the text. And in some copies, if you look, and you'll have to obviously go back to the original Hebrew and find, but there are translations of Babylonian words in the Hebrew that have come over from the Babylonian cuneiform script. And so, of course, Moses, when the tablets came down to him, he was able to actually compile these tablets and edit them and put them together into a final document, and that's how we have the book of Genesis. But he kept a lot of the structure and obviously the original writing that was in the documents. He kept them in there. He may have just simply modified a few things to try to make sure that it was clear and it was accurate, and he preserved them the way that they were handed down to him via the line of the patriarchs. And we know that Moses was familiar with Babylonian cuneiform script and Egyptian, because in both Babylon and in Egypt, this was the main writing style, the main script that was used, this cuneiform. They would send these documents back and forth, kind of like letters we would send today, even though we use email, but letters in writing on paper, and we send them off through the mailbox. Well, they would send them off on horseback, and they'd have these tablets, and they'd send them off to somebody, and that was the way that they communicated. So cuneiform script was very, very popular and very, very widespread throughout the ancient world, and that's why Moses was familiar with it. And that's why copies of the book of Genesis would have come down to him. He would have been able to put it all together, and this is how we have the book of Genesis. So this is not to say that Moses himself could not have actually, God could not have dictated everything that happened in the book of Genesis to Moses on Mount Sinai, because he most certainly could have. But it's more likely that, and it's very realistic, that this could have been passed down to him over the centuries, and an uncorrupted copy was kept, or copies were kept and passed down to him. And of course, we see other documents that sound similar to the events in the book of Genesis. For instance, the Noah's flood and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and other documents that I can't think off the top of my head, but there are several other documents that sound very similar. And those, some scholars would say, well, this all developed in Babylonia, and this is where we get ours as well. Well, I would say that the book of Genesis is actually an accurate copy, and those other, like for instance the Epic of Gilgamesh, that's just a corrupt copy that was, who knows, rewritten based upon inaccurate information and data and writing. So when we get to Abraham, I'd like to present a couple of an actual archaeological findings that point to Abraham and to his existence, because some people have said that Abraham was a mythical character. You've got to prove that Abraham existed. Well, and some people simply just do not accept that Abraham actually existed. He was just a mythical character. Again, going back to the documentary hypothesis, they believe that everything that the Torah had to say was all myth, that it wasn't real history, that it never actually took place. So one of these was an excavation at Nuzu by a person named Edward Chiara, led to the discovery of Babylonian tablets which showed parallels to the customs and laws of Hebrew patriarchal society. Abraham is considered the first Hebrew, and he would have followed the laws and customs of his time. So there have been some tablets there. Other tablets at Nuzu show the rise of a group called the Habiru. Abraham's family had some connection with this group around 2000 BC in Larsa, which is 30 miles away from the Sumerian city of Ur, where Abraham lived, and he was called from Ur. The names Abraham, Isaac, Laban, Jacob, and Joseph were common during the second millennia BC. Abraham appears in some of these tablets as Abba Ramah, or Abba Amra'amah, or Rabba Am'a'ah, and Jacob appears as Yakulel. And these were, of course, commonplace names throughout Palestine as early as 1700 BC. Another Nuzu tablet discovery indicated that the institution of marriage was considered a means of procreation. If a marriage remained childless, the wife was obligated to give her husband a handmaiden by which to have a child. And below, we actually have a quote from a tablet which reads like this: "If Gilim Ninu, the bride, will not bear children, Gilim Inu shall take a woman, and Lulalan, whence the choicest slaves were obtained, as a wife for Shenima, the bridegroom. There was another document that was found at Mari, and the Mari text details practices such as adoption and inheritance, similar to those found in the Genesis account. The tablets speak of the slaughtering of animals when covenants were made, judges similar to the judges of the Old Testament, gods that are also named in the Hebrew Bible, and personal names such as Noah, Abram, Laban, and Jacob. And then there's one more, and this is the so-called tale of Shenuhi, excuse me. And this can actually be compared to Genesis 12, and it can be discovered that when Abraham left Egypt from Canaan, there is an exact parallel in reverse in regard to the instructions given by Pharaoh. So everything would have played out in reverse of that, in which this would point to Abraham actually being there before Pharaoh, and then being asked to leave. So just to kind of bring up some concluding thoughts, I think that a lot of the things that have been said about Genesis are untrue. I think that there is historical and archaeological evidence which point to its historicity, antiquity, and authenticity. Um, I think that the Bible defends itself, and just for our, kind of our own thinking and our own just kind of pondering, there are literally millions of cuneiform tablets that are sitting in museums all over the world that have been uncovered from ancient Mesopotamia and the outlying area. And these basically have been brought in, they've been shipped in, and they're just sitting there in museums. And only a very small percentage of these clay tablets, or tablets, whether they be stone as well, have actually been deciphered and translated and even published. About maybe only 10 to 15%. And hardly anybody knows about these. They're just sitting there in museums, and nobody's actually going through them. But I think that in these somewhere, and of course some people are going to call me crazy, but these are actually historical documents that we have that we could go through. I think that maybe somewhere in some of those, and maybe they're just not uncovered yet, some copies of Genesis are sitting somewhere, whether they be in a museum or they just haven't been uncovered at an excavation site. But I think that because we have so many proofs, so many examples of the book of Genesis being so real, I think that this should actually strengthen our faith. And we should believe the Bible even more, that God has taken the steps, taken the necessary steps to preserve His Word, for us to be not left without a witness. And so I just encourage you all to take time to study and look up some of the historicity and some of the historical things, the archaeological things that point to the book of Genesis being a real book, being a historical book, being an accurate book, and I believe that will strengthen your faith. If we just completely dismiss the book of Genesis, what we're left with is basically what the evolutionists have. They just say, well, our ancestors came from somewhere in Africa. It's a bunch of guesswork, and that's what they're left with. And we, on the other hand, have a historical document that tells us our origin and where we came from. If you want to dismiss it, if some critics want to dismiss the whole book of Genesis as myth, then so be it. But there are clear indications, historical and archaeological things that point to it being an actual historical document. And I think that we should pay attention to that, and because Jesus himself actually quoted from the book of Genesis in referring to marriage and referring to the first two people. He referred to them, as God has put together, let no man put asunder. And so that should, if Jesus looked at the book of Genesis as a real historical document in referring to Adam and Eve as two historical people, using them as example of what marriage should be, then we should most certainly, our faith should be strengthened because of that, and really look at the book of Genesis as a very serious foundational book for us to consider. So I'll leave you with that. Leave comments in below and see what you think, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless you.